Hi everyone, I'm Max the Storyteller, here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you watch these videos to fall asleep, so before we start, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get comfortable. Take a deep breath. I was driving back from a late meeting, eager to reach the warmth of my apartment. The snowstorm hit suddenly, the kind that comes on so fast you can't even see the taillights of the car ahead of you. The wind whipped the snow in thick, heavy sheets, turning everything into a blur of white. I slowed down, my hands tight on the wheel, squinting through the windshield. The visibility was poor, and I was barely able to make out the road. I had no choice but to pull over to the side of the road, hoping to wait the storm out for a bit. My headlights caught something in the distance. It was faint at first, barely visible through the veil of snowflakes that swirled around in the wind. But then I realized there was someone standing there. I couldn't believe it, a lone figure standing still in the middle of nowhere, just standing there in the snow as if waiting. There was nothing around for miles, no house, no other car, just the dark emptiness of the storm. For a moment I thought about driving on. It was dangerous after all. But something about that figure, standing in the snow, caught my attention. Maybe it was the unnatural stillness, or maybe it was the sheer strangeness of seeing someone out here, alone in the middle of such a storm. I glanced at my gas gauge. It was low. I had to make a decision. I rolled down the window, the cold biting into my skin as I called out into the storm. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" There was no immediate response. The figure didn't move, and for a second I wasn't sure if it had heard me, or even if it was real. But then, the person shifted, slowly turning their head toward my car. It was a woman. I could barely make out her features, just the faint outline of a hood, her face hidden by the shadow of her scarf. But what struck me was how pale she looked, her skin almost white and the hollow expression in her eyes like she hadn't seen another living soul in years. I hesitated for a moment, but the cold wind, biting and unforgiving, pushed me to act. She needed help. I couldn't just leave her out there. "Do you need a ride?" "It's dangerous out here," I repeated. She took a slow step toward me. "Yes, please. Anywhere you can take me," she said, her voice soft and raspy. She sounded like someone who had been out in the cold for far too long, her words barely audible over the howling wind. I unlocked the door, and the woman climbed in without a word. As soon as she sat down, I immediately noticed how cold the car seemed to get. Despite the heat running, the temperature inside felt strange, unnaturally cold, like the frost was creeping in from the outside, no matter how many layers of warmth the car could offer. The woman didn't seem to care. She was still wearing her thin, worn-out coat, as if she hadn't prepared for the storm at all. Her hands were trembling, and I could see the frostbite creeping up her fingers, making them pale and discolored. She was shaking, but not from the cold. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I glanced at her, unsure of what to say. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice softer now, trying to gauge her condition. She stared out the window, her eyes unfocused. "I've been waiting for so long." I wasn't sure what she meant, but the way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at the rearview mirror, making sure there were no other cars behind me. The road seemed empty, and the storm had made the world feel even more isolated. "You've been waiting?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Waiting for what?" But she didn't respond, just stared out the window, her gaze distant like she was looking at something far beyond the storm. It was then that I noticed something odd. There were no tire tracks in the snow behind her. No sign of anyone having driven through the area recently. It didn't make sense. The storm was vicious, but the road had been plowed earlier in the day. No one had been here for hours. Yet here she was, as if she had materialized out of the storm itself. A wave of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. But the longer she sat in the passenger seat, the colder the car seemed to get. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to break the silence. She turned slowly to look at me, her eyes pale, almost milky, as though the life had been drained from them. "I don't have a name," she replied, her voice flat, emotionless. "I've forgotten it." That answer sent another chill down my spine, one I couldn't ignore. But it was too late to turn back. Now, I couldn't just leave her on the side of the road. I drove on, trying to keep my attention on the road ahead, hoping the silence would break. But it didn't. The storm intensified, snow blurring the windshield. I adjusted the wipers, trying to keep the glass clear. I could feel my heart rate picking up as the feeling of isolation settled deeper, the darkness of the night pressing in from all sides. Then, just when I thought I couldn't stand the silence anymore, she spoke again. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I could feel the words hanging in the air between us. I blinked, startled. "What?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to look at me, her gaze so intense that it felt like she was peering directly into my soul. The car suddenly felt stifling, as if the walls were closing in. Her eyes didn't blink. They just watched me, unblinking. I forced my gaze back to the road, my hands tightening around the wheel, my pulse racing. The storm outside seemed to be growing worse by the minute. The wind howled, rattling the windows as the snow piled up, making it harder to see. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. I didn't want to hear the answer, but I couldn't stop myself. She smiled then, a thin, haunting smile that stretched unnaturally across her face. It was not a smile of relief or gratitude, but one that made my blood run cold. "I've been waiting for you to stop," she said. "I've been waiting for someone to take me." I didn't understand. A cold dread settled over me, and I could feel my breath becoming shallow. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, my heart leaping in my chest as I saw something I hadn't noticed before. There was no reflection in the glass, no image of us sitting in the car, no headlights glinting off the snow-covered road. Just an empty void. I snapped my head back toward her, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the icy road. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced frantically around, searching for her. But the car was empty, completely empty. I looked in the rearview mirror once more. The storm had cleared slightly, and I saw, standing in the road behind me, the same woman. But this time, she wasn't alone. There were others. More figures, pale and ghostly, standing in the snow, watching me. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished into the storm. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I looked around frantically, but the road was now empty. The woman and the strange figures were gone, swallowed by the blizzard. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting, watching. I drove on, never looking back. I reached my apartment hours later, my hands still trembling, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about those figures, those strangers in the snow, waiting for someone to stop. And I couldn't shake the words she had whispered to me, the way she had stared at me with those empty eyes. "I've been waiting for you." To this day, I can't help but wonder if I really gave that woman a ride at all, or if it was something else, something darker, something I had been drawn to in that storm. I haven't been able to sleep properly since that night. Every time I hear the wind howl or see the snow falling, I feel a chill run down my spine. Because I know one thing for certain, they're still out there, waiting. I had been driving for hours, my hands clenched tightly around the wheel as the snowstorm raged outside. The weather was unforgiving, a relentless wall of white, whipping across the road and reducing visibility to nearly zero. The winds howled. The temperature had dropped, and I couldn't even make out the road signs anymore. The vast, desolate stretch of highway seemed to stretch on forever with no sign of civilization. Just endless snow. It was Christmas Eve, and I had been traveling to visit family, but the weather had gotten worse by the minute. My phone had long lost its signal, and I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of isolation. The snowflakes danced against the windshield in a hypnotic pattern, but there was no mistaking the increasing sense of dread that weighed on me. I knew I was far from any town, and the nearest gas station seemed like a distant memory. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw something up ahead. A flickering light in the distance, it looked like a cabin standing alone in the storm. I sighed in relief, my eyes squinting through the snow. A place to rest, maybe even some warmth. I pulled off the road and toward the cabin, my tires slipping slightly as I navigated through the thickening snow. When I reached the door, I was surprised to see it slightly ajar. A wooden porch creaked beneath my boots as I stepped out of the car, the wind biting at my exposed skin. I hesitated for only a second before pushing the door open. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of wood smoke. A fire crackled in the hearth, filling the cabin with a golden glow. The floorboards were well worn, the walls covered with thick curtains and antique decorations. It had an almost timeless feel, like stepping into a forgotten era. I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to be out of the storm. The cabin appeared to be abandoned, but it didn't feel empty. It felt alive, as though it were waiting for me. The eerie feeling was momentarily dismissed as the heat from the fire sank into my skin. I stepped farther in, closing the door behind me. My boots left wet imprints on the hardwood floor, the melted snow dripping off my coat. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice barely broke the silence. No answer. No sounds, except the crackling fire. I looked around, hoping to see some sign of life, perhaps a caretaker or someone who had taken refuge from the storm, but there was no one. The only sound was the wind howling outside and the occasional pop of the fire. After a few moments of standing still, I made my way over to the hearth, taking off my coat and scarf. The warmth was a relief, and I let out a long breath as I sat down on the couch near the fire. My legs felt weak from the drive, and I could already feel the stress of the journey slipping away, replaced by a heavy sense of drowsiness. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange about the cabin. There were no signs of recent habitation, no dust on the furniture, no signs of anyone living here for a long time. Yet the fire was still crackling, as if someone had just left. It was as if I had walked into a place frozen in time, a moment before abandonment. I shook my head, trying to banish the strange thoughts. It was just the storm, the isolation. It was getting to me. I had been on the road too long. I got up to check the kitchen, hoping for something to drink, something to keep me awake. The kitchen was simple. An old stove, a worn-out table, some cupboards that were mostly bare. But then, I noticed something out of place. A freshly opened tin of soup sitting on the counter. My heart skipped a beat. Who could have been here recently? The fire still burning, the untouched food. Suddenly, a sharp knock at the door sent me stumbling backward. My pulse raced as I glanced toward the entrance. The storm outside had intensified, but I hadn't heard a car pull up. Who could it be? The snow was too thick for anyone to be out there, especially someone who would knock instead of simply entering. I hesitated, heart pounding in my chest. There was no reason to panic, I told myself. It was probably someone else caught in the storm seeking shelter. I moved cautiously toward the door, my mind racing. The knock came again, louder this time, almost insistent. I reached for the doorknob, but a sudden, overwhelming sense of unease swept over me. A gut feeling, something primal, told me not to open that door. I pulled my hand back, uncertain what to do. The knocking didn't stop, it kept coming, faster, more demanding. I backed away, my mind spiraling. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was some kind of trick of the storm, the noise playing with my head. But I knew it wasn't. I rushed toward the windows, peering out through the frosted panes. The snow had thickened so much that I could barely make out the surrounding woods. There was no sign of anyone outside, just a thick, white blur. I turned around, feeling dizzy, and noticed something that froze me in place. On the far side of the room, a shadow moved across the wall. I stood frozen, staring at the dark shape, my pulse hammering in my ears. The shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally long, flickering like a reflection, before vanishing completely. I shook my head, telling myself it was the firelight playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I rushed back to the fire, trying to steady my breathing, but the air in the room had grown colder. I rubbed my arms, feeling an icy chill creep up my spine. The warmth from the fire seemed to fade, as though the room was slowly being drawn into something else, something darker. Then, the door creaked open. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There was no one there, but the door had opened by itself, just a crack. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows around the room, and I could hear something, soft, whispering. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was too distinct, too deliberate. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the storm, but I knew it was there. A whisper, soft, trembling. I stepped toward the door, and as I did, I heard it again. "Help me." The voice was growing louder now, almost pleading. I reached for the door, but before I could open it, I felt something cold brush against my arm. A cold, like no other, sharp and biting, like ice seeping into my bones. I turned to find the room plunged into darkness. The fire was gone, and the room was so cold that I could see my breath. My pulse raced as I backed away from the door, heart pounding in my chest. The whispering continued, growing louder and louder. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing with the voice of something trapped inside. I looked back toward the fire, but it was no longer there. The warmth had disappeared, replaced by a suffocating cold that filled the cabin. The shadows had grown longer, stretching across the walls, as though they were reaching for me. "Please." The voice was closer now, almost in the room with me. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I ran for the door, my hands fumbling as I tried to force it open, but it was stuck. The snowstorm outside was blinding, and I was suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was in this strange place. And then, as I struggled with the door, I heard something else. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a loud, guttural sound, like something dragging itself across the floor, slow and deliberate. I turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there, only the darkness and the cold. I pulled harder on the door, but it wouldn't budge. I looked around frantically, searching for something to pry it open with. That's when I noticed the figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face pale and frozen in terror, her clothes ragged and torn. Her hair was matted with snow, her eyes wide and vacant. She reached out toward me, her fingers skeletal and long, stretching toward me like they were made of ice. I screamed, but it was too late. The door finally gave way, and I stumbled out into the storm, but the figure followed me. Her footsteps left no marks in the snow, her body seeming to fade and vanish with each step. I ran, the storm swallowing me whole. The winds howled, the snow stinging my face as I ran deeper into the woods. But the figure was always there, always just behind me. I stumbled and fell, my body heavy with exhaustion. But when I looked back, she was gone. I made it to my car and drove away, my heart racing in my chest. The cabin disappeared behind me, swallowed by the storm. I drove all night, not stopping until I reached the nearest town, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. I've never gone back to the cabin, and I never will. And every time the snow falls heavily, I remember the woman in the storm, her pale face, her frozen hands, and the whisper that still haunts me. It was late in the evening when I first noticed the storm picking up. I had just wrapped up a long day of work and was heading home, looking forward to a warm dinner and a good night's sleep. The snow began to fall lightly at first, barely noticeable against the dark sky. But it didn't take long for the flakes to grow larger, heavier. I had taken the back roads for the quicker route to my cabin, cutting through a stretch of rural highway flanked by dense woods. The radio hummed a familiar tune, but it felt drowned out by the growing howls of wind outside. The further I drove, the more it seemed like the world around me was disappearing under a blanket of snow. The road became slick and treacherous, and my tires started to spin a bit, despite the careful speed I maintained. By the time I passed the old mill, the snow had become blinding. It was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, and I knew I was approaching the worst of it. The wind howled, like some trapped animal, pushing and pulling at the car as I fought to keep it steady. I was the only one on this stretch of highway now, save for a few rusted road signs, their faces hidden beneath a thick layer of snow. And that was when I saw him. At first I thought it was a trick of the storm. The figure was just a shadow in the whiteness, a silhouette that looked strangely familiar, though I couldn't place why. He stood by the side of the road, facing me with his back turned, his body hunched against the wind. His coat was threadbare and looked far too thin for the brutal cold, and I could make out the telltale signs of frostbite on his exposed skin. He stood still, as if waiting, the snow swirling around him in erratic patterns that seemed to obey his every movement. I slowed down as I neared him. There was no other sign of life for miles around. He was alone, and as much as I wanted to ignore him, something in me couldn't leave him stranded out there. I knew that any help I could offer might save a life. I pulled to a stop a few feet ahead of him, my headlights cutting through the storm in a sharp beam. The moment I stopped, he turned and I saw his eyes. They were pure white, clouded with frost, as if the cold had claimed his vision long ago. His face was gaunt, stretched thin by hunger or time, and his lips cracked open as he spoke, though his voice was soft, barely more than a whisper against the wind. "I can't see," he rasped. My heart skipped a beat. I opened the door cautiously, already feeling that twinge of discomfort. "Do you need help?" I called, my voice muffled by the snow. He nodded, but it was a slow, deliberate motion, as though every movement was weighed down by something. I didn't know what had brought him out here, alone in this storm, but I felt that sense of duty deep in my chest. I couldn't leave him like this. "Hop in," I said, my voice carrying a little more warmth than I felt. "It's dangerous out here." He didn't move at first, and I found myself staring at him, waiting for some sign. Finally, he shuffled over to the passenger door and climbed in, his movements jerky, uncoordinated. I watched as he settled into the seat beside me. His presence, now that he was inside the car, seemed to fill the space, pressing against me in a way I couldn't explain. I offered him a nervous glance. He was silent, staring out of the windshield, his white eyes fixed on nothing at all. The snowstorm outside had intensified, the wind whipping at the windows, and yet he didn't react. His stillness unsettled me, but I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the chill that seemed to creep through the car's heater. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He didn't answer immediately, but then, with a raspy breath, he murmured, "Anywhere but here. Anywhere but this place." His voice echoed strangely in the car, almost hollow, as though it were coming from a place far deeper than his body. I glanced at him again, unsure whether to press for more answers or simply let him be. I didn't want to know, but I couldn't stop myself. "What's your name?" He didn't respond at first. I thought for a moment that he hadn't heard me, but then he turned to face me, his head tilting slightly, his white eyes fixated on me as if studying me. "You don't need to know my name," he said. His voice was eerily calm, but there was something dark buried beneath it, something ancient. I shivered, both from the cold and from the unsettling feeling growing in my gut. I wanted to ask him more, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. Instead, I focused on the road, pressing the gas pedal harder as the snow seemed to grow heavier, the visibility almost non-existent. I should have asked him where he came from, where he was going, but I didn't. Time stretched between us, each minute feeling like an eternity. I dared a glance at him again, and for a split second I thought I saw something shifting in the rearview mirror. A figure standing behind the car, standing far too close. But when I looked again, nothing was there. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned to the road, my heart pounding as I tried to shake the feeling of being watched. And then, the voice returned. "You shouldn't have stopped." It was barely a whisper, so soft I could barely hear it above the sound of the storm. I glanced over at the man. He hadn't moved. His head was still turned toward the snowstorm outside, his eyes blank, his hands folded in his lap. "What?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you mean?" But the man was silent. The car's engine sputtered. The road in front of me began to appear less like a clear path and more like an endless sea of white, the snow blurring the lines between the road and the horizon. Panic surged through me. I slammed my foot on the gas, trying to keep control, but the car began to fishtail, its tires struggling to grip the slick, icy surface. The man didn't seem to notice. He was staring out the window, muttering to himself. I could only catch bits and pieces, but they didn't make sense. "It's cold," he murmured. "I can't see, but I know you're there." His voice was increasingly frantic, the words blending together like fragments of some forgotten language. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I fought the car against the storm. And then, everything went wrong. The wind picked up. The car veered sharply to the left, sliding across the ice. I tried to correct, but it was too late. The tires lost traction completely, and before I could react, the car slid off the road and down a small embankment. Everything went dark for a moment. When I regained my bearings, I realized the car was stuck. Snow piled high against the windows, and I could barely see through the thick frost on the glass. I turned to look at the man. He was gone. The seat beside me was empty, the door hanging open, just slightly ajar. The snowstorm outside roared in, like a living thing, but there was no sign of him. I opened the door and stepped out, into the swirling storm, my boots sinking into the snow with each step. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely reaching over the wind. "Where are you?" There was no answer, but I felt it, the unmistakable weight of eyes on me. I spun around, but saw nothing in the blinding snow. I walked a few steps farther, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The trees around me seemed to stretch impossibly high, their branches shaking violently in the wind. And then, through the haze of falling snow, I saw him again. He stood at the edge of the trees, his back to me, motionless. His face, pale and ghostly, was turned toward the sky, as if he were listening to the wind. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered. I backed away in horror, but before I could run, I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The road, the man, the car, everything had vanished. The storm continued to rage, swallowing everything in its path, but the man was nowhere to be seen. I was alone, and I was lost. I had come to this cabin in the woods to escape the chaos of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the endless buzz of technology, and the ever-present noise that seemed to swallow everything. A week alone in the wilderness was supposed to be peaceful, a time for introspection and clarity. The air was supposed to be clean, the nights quiet, and the days slow and calm. But I couldn't have known how wrong that assumption would turn out to be. The first few days went by without incident. The forest around the cabin was serene, unspoiled by modern life. The trees stood like ancient sentinels, their branches dusted with the lightest powder of snow. The crunch of my boots in the snow was the only sound that accompanied me on my morning walks. I would spend hours hiking, watching the wildlife from a distance and listening to the soft murmur of the wind. The world felt different here, pure. By the fourth night, I was starting to feel a bit too much at home in the stillness. It was a Friday evening, and the sun had already dipped behind the horizon. I'd made myself a small dinner, and after eating, I wrapped myself in a thick blanket and settled into an armchair by the fire. The firelight danced across the wooden walls, casting long shadows and filling the room with a cozy warmth. Everything was perfect. For once, there was nothing to worry about. But that night, something felt different. I didn't immediately notice it. At first, I thought it was the wind howling through the trees. The wind had a way of making strange sounds here. But then I began to hear it, a whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, and I assumed it was just the wind pushing against the house. But the longer I listened, the more distinct the whispers became. At first, I tried to ignore them, chalking it up to the isolation getting to me. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. And then they changed. The wind was no longer the only thing I could hear. There were words now, and the words, they were calling my name. Isabella. I froze, feeling a chill race down my spine. No one knew I was out here. I had kept it all to myself. No one had been in the cabin with me, and no one was expected. And yet, that whisper, the soft, delicate tone, like someone standing just outside the door, had called me by name. Isabella, come outside. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up, my heart pounding. I thought for a moment that maybe it was a trick of the wind or some animal prowling outside, but the voice, it sounded too human, too clear, and it was calling me. Against every instinct I had, I found myself stepping toward the door. The whispers were growing louder, more urgent, as if the voice was struggling to reach me through the thick walls of the cabin. Isabella, come outside. The voice now had a pleading quality, as though it had been waiting for me, as though I had been expected. I hesitated. Every cell in my body screamed for me to stay inside, to shut the door and lock it tight, but I couldn't. There was something compelling me to open that door, something that was too strong to ignore. I grabbed the old brass doorknob, my fingers trembling, and slowly pulled it open. The cold hit me like a wave. The wind cut through my jacket as if it didn't exist, biting into my skin. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the ground in a thick sheet of white. The only light was from the cabin, glowing in a warm amber hue behind me, making the shadows stretch long and dark. I stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath my boots. I squinted into the darkness, my eyes searching for anything that might explain what was happening. The whispers didn't stop. They had followed me outside, swirling around me like an invisible fog, and now I could hear them clearly, coming from all directions. They sounded almost like a chant. Too many voices, speaking at once, in hushed, disjointed tones. "Isabella, come to us." I looked around, confused, my breath forming little clouds in the icy air. The trees loomed around me, their branches heavy with snow, casting eerie, crooked shadows across the ground. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful during the day, now felt alive, watchful, waiting. The wind howled again, louder this time, and for a moment I thought I saw something move at the edge of the forest. It was a shadow, just barely visible against the blackness of the trees. Something tall. It stood perfectly still, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then, it moved. I took a step back, my heart racing in my chest. The figure was coming closer. Slowly, methodically. It was moving out of the darkness, its form obscured by the snowstorm, but I could make out a shape. A tall figure, wrapped in tattered clothing, its face hidden beneath a hood. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. I didn't know what I was expecting, but my breath caught in my throat when the figure didn't stop. It was getting closer, its footsteps light and deliberate in the snow. The whispers grew louder, now like a chorus, all chanting in unison. "Come closer. Please, stop," I begged, my voice barely audible over the storm. But the figure didn't stop. It was now only a few feet away, its long, twisted limbs moving like something inhuman. It raised a hand, and the shadows seemed to warp around it, as though they were alive. I wanted to run. I should have run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, frozen by a fear I couldn't explain. "Don't be afraid," the voice said, though it was not the same voice that had been whispering earlier. This one was deep, guttural, like something ancient. "We have been waiting for you. Come join us. Join the forest." I could hear the breath in my throat, my pulse thumping in my ears. The figure reached up, pulling back the hood, and that's when I saw it. The face. Hollow. Empty. With no eyes, just black sockets staring back at me. Its skin was the color of snow, but stretched too thin as though it was made of ice and frost. Its lips curled into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp teeth. I stumbled backward, my body moving in slow motion as though the fear had paralyzed me. "What do you want?" I stammered. The figure didn't speak at first, but the whispers intensified, as if they were all around me, rising in volume until it felt like the entire forest was pressing against my ears. Then it spoke again, its voice now clearer, more distinct. "You belong to the woods now," it said. "The forest calls to you, Isabella. We've been waiting for you." A sharp gust of wind blew past me, and in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. The whispers faded with it, leaving only the howling of the wind and the oppressive silence of the snow-covered trees. I stood there, trembling, not daring to move. My mind was racing, my thoughts tangled in confusion and terror. What had just happened? What had I seen? I ran back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wouldn't be. I had chosen a cabin far from any kind of civilization. The forest was silent now, too silent. I spent the night in the cabin, staring at the door, waiting for the whispers to return. But they didn't. The only sounds I could hear were the occasional creaks of the house as the wind continued to howl outside. The next morning I left. I didn't care if the snowstorm still raged, or if I would be lost in the woods. I couldn't stay in that cabin, not after what I'd experienced. I couldn't risk the forest calling me again. As I walked away from the cabin, I heard it. A faint whisper, soft and distant, yet unmistakable. "Isabella, you can never leave." I ran faster, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the road, I turned back one last time. The cabin was gone. The trees stood still in the distance, silent as always. But in the very farthest reaches of the forest, there was movement. A figure watching, waiting, and I knew it would follow me forever. The winter had been unusually harsh that year, and I found myself craving a break from the monotony of city life. After weeks of work, the constant noise and the never-ending hustle, I decided to take a weekend getaway to the countryside. A remote cabin on the edge of a frozen lake seemed like the perfect escape. I could get away from everything, spend some time reflecting, and enjoy the stillness of nature. I had rented the cabin for 3 days, and when I arrived, the landscape looked like something out of a postcard. Snow blanketed the ground in perfect white sheets, and the trees were heavy with frost, their branches bending slightly under the weight. The lake, which lay just a few hundred feet from the cabin, was frozen solid, a glassy expanse of ice stretching as far as the eye could see. The air was crisp and biting, but in a way that felt refreshing, cleansing even. The cabin itself was small, nestled on the edge of the woods. It was older, with creaky wooden floors and a fireplace that gave off a comforting glow, the perfect place for solitude. The owner had left me a note on the kitchen table with some basic instructions, and after settling in, I unpacked my things and decided to take a walk around the area. I pulled on my thickest jacket, scarf, and gloves, feeling the chill nip at my skin the moment I stepped outside. The lake was just a short walk from the cabin, and I followed a narrow path leading down to its edge. The snow crunched beneath my boots with each step, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence that surrounded me. The sky was a pale gray, overcast, and the low sun filtered weakly through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow. As I approached the lake, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the woods and stopping at the frozen surface. The prints were deep, as if someone had walked there recently, but there was no one in sight. I peered around the area, my breath clouding in front of me, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Curiosity gnawed at me. I hadn't seen any other signs of life since I'd arrived, and the idea that someone had been out here so recently felt odd. The footprints didn't look particularly old, though the snow was thick and everything else seemed untouched. Without thinking, I stepped closer to the edge of the lake. The frozen surface was smooth and flawless, and I could see the deep cracks and crevices beneath the ice. The strange thing, however, was that the footprints didn't lead back to the woods. They ended abruptly at the edge of the lake as if the person had just disappeared. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. Maybe someone had just walked out onto the ice and turned back. The snow was relentless out here, and it was easy to get disoriented. I stepped onto the ice carefully, testing it with my boot. It held firm beneath me, and I slowly walked further out, enjoying the stillness. There was something calming about being out there, surrounded by nothing but snow, ice, and the vast emptiness of the lake. I walked for a while, lost in thought, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The wind picked up slightly, swirling the snow in front of me and making it hard to see much further. Still, I pressed on, fascinated by the eerie quiet that seemed to stretch for miles. As I walked, I began to feel a sense of unease, a creeping feeling that I was being watched. I stopped, listening to the wind, the faint rustling of the trees on the shore. It was just the wind, I told myself, trying to shake off the sensation. But then, I heard it. A soft, cracking sound, almost imperceptible at first, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. I turned around, scanning the lake behind me, but there was nothing. The ice was still, save for my own footprints trailing behind me. I brushed it off as the ice settling beneath me. But the sound came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scraping sound, like something was dragging along the surface of the lake. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around once again, this time more slowly, my eyes scanning the horizon. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, just barely visible through the snowstorm that was beginning to pick up. The figure was tall and thin, its form shifting with the wind. It was standing at the far edge of the lake, near the trees, but it didn't seem to move. Its presence made my skin crawl, and a chill gripped me that had nothing to do with the cold. I took a hesitant step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't seem to notice me. I tried to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I slowly turned and began to make my way back to the shore. As I walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The figure was gone. No trace, nothing, just the empty, snow-covered lake. I let out a sigh of relief, but my unease remained. By the time I reached the cabin, the storm had intensified. Snow fell heavily from the sky, obscuring everything in a thick, white blanket. I locked the door behind me, trying to shake off the odd feeling that lingered. I turned on the fireplace and sat down with a book, but I couldn't concentrate. Every time I looked up, I expected to see someone, standing just beyond the window. Night fell quickly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind howled outside, making the cabin groan and creak. My thoughts kept drifting back to the figure on the ice, its dark outline just visible through the snow. The more I tried to dismiss it, the more the memory of it haunted me. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I climbed into bed, trying to shut out the storm and the haunting thoughts. But as I lay there, something in the back of my mind kept nagging at me. The memory of the footprints, the figure, and that awful sense of being watched. I didn't sleep well that night. The wind rattled the windows, and I kept hearing strange sounds, scratching noises, as if something was dragging along the wood. At one point, I got up to check, but there was nothing. The house was empty, silent. The next morning, the snowstorm had passed. The sun broke through the clouds, and the world outside seemed fresh and untouched. The lake gleamed in the early light, a peaceful expanse of white and blue. But as I stepped outside, I saw it, another set of footprints leading from the cabin down toward the lake. These footprints were fresh, unmistakably so. I froze. I hadn't left the cabin yet, so these couldn't be mine. The footsteps were large, stretching across the snow, and they led right to the edge of the lake, right where the figure had stood the night before. I wanted to leave. The unease was building in my chest, the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But instead, I found myself walking toward the lake again, drawn to it like a magnet. The footsteps continued on the ice, but this time they were more erratic, jagged lines as if someone had been stumbling. I followed them slowly, trying to calm my racing heart. The air was still and cold, but there was a heaviness to it, a sense that something was waiting. As I walked, I noticed the cracks in the ice were wider, the crevices deeper. I stepped carefully, but the sound of the ice beneath me was unsettling. The cracks groaned as if the lake was alive, shifting, pulling me deeper. I followed the footprints, my every step echoing across the ice. And then, I saw it. The figure. It was no longer standing at the edge. It was in the middle of the lake, walking toward me, its movement unnaturally slow, deliberate. Its face was obscured by a hood, and its hands were covered in gloves, but its presence was unmistakable. I froze, unable to move, my breath caught in my throat. The figure stopped about 20 feet away, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the wind picked up, and the snow began to swirl around us, obscuring my vision. I tried to take a step back, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the lake itself was holding me in place. The figure raised its arm, and in that moment, I knew it wasn't human. The hand was too long, the fingers too thin, covered in ice as if they had been frozen into the very fabric of the storm. "Leave this place," a voice whispered through the wind, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The figure took one step toward me and the ice beneath my feet cracked. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, my bones. I was being pulled down, deeper into the frozen lake. With all the strength I could muster, I broke free from the trance. I turned and ran, my legs shaking beneath me, toward the shore. The cracking of the ice followed me, growing louder and louder with every step. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked every window and door, trembling as I sank to the floor. The storm had stopped, and the lake outside was silent. But the echoes of that voice, the whisper that had warned me, still lingered in my ears. I was no longer alone. The figure on the ice was not just a phantom of my mind. It was something far worse. And it wasn't going anywhere. I had been driving for hours, my eyes weary from the endless stretch of empty highways and swirling snow. The storm had been coming in for a while, thick and unforgiving, blanketing everything in an unrelenting veil of white. It had started as a light dusting, but now the snow was falling heavily, covering the roads in thick layers. The windshield wipers worked overtime, struggling to keep up with the relentless onslaught from the sky. I had no particular destination in mind, just wanting to escape the hustle of the city for a while. The prospect of finding some peace and quiet in the mountains was a tempting idea. There had been stories of a small, remote village in the hills, one that had long been forgotten by the rest of the world. People spoke of it with a sense of mystique, but no one seemed to know exactly where it was. It was then, just as the roads began to vanish beneath a blanket of snow, that I saw the sign. The road sign was nearly buried under the snow, but it was still visible enough for me to read, "Welcome to Grensford." The name was unfamiliar, but I figured it was just a small village tucked away in the mountains, probably not on any major map. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the snow had begun to fall more heavily, making me second-guess whether it was safe to continue. But the promise of a warm place to stay during the storm pushed me forward. I turned onto the narrow road that led into the village. The air felt colder here, as though I had crossed into a different world entirely. The trees were draped in heavy coats of snow, their branches sagging under the weight. The houses on the outskirts of the village looked old, their roofs steep and covered in thick layers of snow. It was almost like stepping back in time to a place untouched by modernity. There were no signs of life, no lights, no movement. Just the eerie quiet of the snowstorm. I drove deeper into the village, my headlights casting long, strange shadows on the snow. The village was eerily still, almost as if it had been abandoned for years. The buildings, though sturdy, appeared dilapidated. Paint chipped off the wooden frames of houses, and there were boards nailed over some of the windows. The village square, usually a gathering place in any town, was desolate. I parked my car on the side of the street, my engine echoing against the empty buildings. I was beginning to feel a sense of unease, but I figured I was just imagining things. It was the storm, the isolation. It made everything feel strange. I walked to the closest house and knocked on the door, but there was no response. I knocked again, this time harder, but still nothing. I tried the next house and then the next, but it was the same every time. No one answered. There were no signs of life, no sounds, no warmth. I started to feel the first pricks of anxiety crawling up my spine. It didn't make sense. A village couldn't just be empty. I thought maybe it was just late, or perhaps everyone was holed up in their homes because of the storm. But something felt off, something I couldn't quite place. I walked further into the village, my breath leaving visible clouds in the freezing air. The village seemed frozen in time, like something out of a forgotten era. As I wandered, I noticed a small, dilapidated inn near the center of town. The sign above the door read, "The Grensford Inn," its letters barely visible beneath a layer of snow. It was the only place that seemed like it might have some warmth to offer. I pushed open the door, and a bell above the entrance rang, the sound eerily loud in the silence. The innkeeper was an elderly woman, her hair white as snow, and her face lined with age. She looked at me without speaking, her eyes distant, almost unnerving. "Room for the night?" I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping up in my chest. She nodded, her movement slow and deliberate, almost as though she had been expecting me. She didn't ask for my name or any information. She just handed me a key, the heavy metal one clinking against the counter as she slid it toward me. "The storm is strong tonight," she said, her voice low and raspy. "You'll be safe here for now." I took the key, grateful for a roof over my head, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air inside the inn was warmer, but still, there was something strange about it. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the walls, and the fire crackling in the hearth barely seemed to touch the chill in the room. The innkeeper didn't say much else as she led me upstairs to my room, the narrow hallway dim and cold despite the flames below. The room was small and sparsely furnished with an old squeaky bed covered in thick, worn blankets. The windows were covered in a thick layer of frost, making it nearly impossible to see the snowstorm outside. It was peaceful, but also unsettling in its stillness. I pulled the curtains shut, trying to keep out the eerie cold, and settled down on the bed, wrapping myself in the blankets. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though something was waiting, watching, just beyond my vision. I finally managed to drift off, but the dreams were restless. In the darkness of the night, I saw figures standing in the village square, staring at me with hollow, lifeless eyes. Their faces were pale, frozen, and blank, their mouths open in silent screams. I awoke in a cold sweat, heart racing, the room still pitch black. I tried to shake off the feeling and told myself it was just the storm. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but the cold from the outside was no match for the terror that gripped me from within. My skin felt clammy, cold to the touch, but the room was heated. I tried to fall back asleep, but was too unsettled. As I lay in bed, trying to calm myself, I heard something strange, the faintest sound of footsteps coming from the hallway outside. The floorboards creaked softly, and I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps seemed to circle around the room, as though someone was walking outside my door, pacing in slow, deliberate steps. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding. I grabbed the door handle and swung it open, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. The footsteps had stopped as soon as I opened the door, and the only sound now was the wind howling through the cracks in the building. I stepped into the hallway, unsure of what to do. As I walked toward the stairs, I looked down at the innkeeper's door, which stood slightly ajar. A faint light flickered within, casting long shadows across the floor. My curiosity got the best of me, and I tiptoed toward the room, listening carefully. I heard her voice, low, almost a whisper. "They're coming." A chill ran down my spine. I was sure she was speaking to someone, though there was no one else in the building. I slowly pushed open the door, but the room was empty. The light flickered from a candle on the table, and nothing seemed out of place. But there, on the floor near the door, was a pile of snow, fresh, undisturbed, as though it had just been tracked inside. I quickly shut the door behind me and rushed down the stairs, my mind racing. The innkeeper's words echoed in my mind. "They're coming." But who was she talking about? The storm outside had intensified, and the wind screamed in fury as I stood at the bottom of the stairs. I glanced around, my heart hammering in my chest. Something was wrong with this village. Something wasn't right. The innkeeper appeared in the doorway behind me, her frail form casting a shadow over the threshold. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her eyes wide with a strange, distant fear. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around to face her, but before I could respond, a noise echoed from the village square. It wasn't the wind or the storm. It was something else. A low, guttural sound, like the earth itself was groaning under the weight of something heavy. I stepped closer to the window and looked outside. The snow was swirling in wild patterns, the moonlight casting strange shapes across the village. But in the distance, I saw them, figures moving through the snow, their bodies hunched and unnatural. They were coming toward the inn, their slow, deliberate steps almost in sync. I felt the ground beneath my feet shift, and the walls seemed to close in. The innkeeper's warning played over and over in my head. "You shouldn't have come." I ran to the door, but it was locked, the key gone from the counter. My heart pounded as the figures grew closer, and the cold from outside crept into the inn, freezing everything in its path. The storm had stopped, but the village was trapped in a timeless void, frozen in place. And so was I. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The snow outside, the figures, the innkeeper's eyes, they were all part of the same terrible truth. I was never meant to leave Grensford. It had been a long day and I was exhausted. The snowstorm came out of nowhere, a violent gust of wind that whipped through the trees, carrying with it the kind of cold that bit into your bones. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home, but the snow was coming down so fast I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The roads were slick and treacherous, and as the visibility worsened, I found myself in an area I didn't recognize. I pulled over, thinking it might be best to wait out the storm. The wind howled outside, rattling the car, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. It had been years since I'd driven in a storm this severe. I glanced at the empty, snow-covered landscape around me, hoping the storm would pass as quickly as it had arrived. But then I saw something through the falling snow, a flicker of movement just beyond the trees. At first I thought I had imagined it. A deer, perhaps, or some other animal. But as I watched, the movement came closer, too close and too deliberate to be an animal. I squinted against the wind, heart starting to pound. The figure seemed to be walking, moving slowly toward me, a shadow in the blinding white. I tried to convince myself it was just a person caught in the storm. Maybe they had lost their way, stranded like me. But as the figure neared, I could see it more clearly, and it wasn't human. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its frame thin, like a tree that had been twisted by the wind. Its arms hung loosely at its sides, long and skeletal, with joints that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. I couldn't make out its face. Not yet, but I could see the way it moved. Slowly, deliberately, its steps uneven, like it was dragging its feet through the snow. I sat frozen in my car, my mind racing. Should I get out and help? Call for help? My fingers hovered over the door handle, but something in the back of my mind told me not to. I knew something was wrong, deep down. Then, the figure stopped just outside my window. It tilted its head slightly, as if noticing me for the first time. The wind howled around us, but there was a sudden silence, a deep, suffocating quiet that hung in the air. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, as if the storm itself had become aware of us, holding its breath. The creature didn't speak. Not at first, it just stood there, motionless. And I realized with a jolt of fear that it was looking at me. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were black, empty voids, like deep pits that swallowed light. I felt a chill run down my spine, my skin crawling at the sight of it. There was no expression, no warmth, only that eerie blackness, the void in its face. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, heart racing as I sped away from the figure, not daring to look back. The snow whipped around my car, the windshield wipers barely able to keep up with the blizzard's fury. I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, nothing. Then I saw it. The creature was still there. Now, in the middle of the road, moving toward me. It had covered the distance between us impossibly fast, without running, just gliding over the snow, its long limbs swinging unnaturally. The moonlight cut the dark, glistening surface of its skin, making it look like something made of shadows, a grotesque reflection of the world around it. My heart pounded as I pressed the gas pedal harder, desperate to get away from it. The storm raged, and the world outside the car turned into a swirling mass of white. But no matter how fast I drove, the creature seemed to be keeping pace with me, always just behind, always just out of sight, as if it were following the car instead of running after it. I knew I had to get somewhere safe. A town, a gas station, anything. But the storm had trapped me in the middle of nowhere. There were no lights in the distance, no signs of life. It felt like I was the only person left in the world, a lone survivor racing against something unnatural. Then, as I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights flashed across something, a small building in the distance, barely visible through the thick snow. A cabin. A tiny structure, isolated, standing like a beacon in the dark. Without thinking, I veered off the road, praying that it was a safe place. I pulled up to the cabin and slammed the car into park. I quickly got out, locking the doors behind me. My breath came in short bursts as I hurried up the porch stairs, my fingers fumbling with the door handle. I pushed the door open, nearly falling inside as I stumbled into the warmth of the cabin. But, as soon as I entered, I knew something was wrong. The place was too quiet, too still. There was a faint smell in the air, something musty, like mold, mixed with the scent of something else I couldn't place, something metallic, like blood. I hesitated at the door, turning back to the blinding snowstorm outside. The creature was out there. I could feel its presence, even without seeing it. My mind raced. Did it follow me? Was it watching from the darkness, waiting for the right moment? But I knew I couldn't stay out there in the storm. I couldn't risk it. I stepped farther into the cabin, my eyes darting around the room. The small space was poorly lit, but there were signs of recent use. A fire still burned in the hearth, crackling softly. A coat hung by the door, the fabric worn and faded. I walked further in, heart still racing. And then I saw it. At the far side of the room, there was a chair facing the fire. It was empty, but the hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I noticed something strange about it. A faint outline was pressed into the fabric of the chair, as if someone had just been sitting there. A shadow, an impression left behind. I turned to look around the room again, every creak of the old wood beneath my feet sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. The fire crackled and popped, casting long shadows on the walls. Everything felt off, like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then I heard it. A soft scraping sound coming from behind the door, the one I had just entered through. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The air was thick with tension, and the storm outside seemed to have calmed for just a moment. I took a careful step toward the door, then another. Slowly, I reached for the handle and pulled it open. The figure was there, standing in the snow. It wasn't quite like the creature I had seen earlier, but it was still tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and thin, like branches of a tree. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and its eyes, those black, empty eyes, locked onto mine with a chilling intensity. The wind had stopped completely now. The world outside the cabin was silent, as if everything had been frozen in place. The creature didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its head tilted slightly, its hands hanging limply at its sides. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in frantic gasps. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just seen, what I was dealing with. I backed away from the door, retreating into the cabin. But the fear, it was suffocating. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. The storm was already subsiding, and I knew the roads had to be passable soon. But no matter how I tried to make myself move, I couldn't. It was as though my body was paralyzed by the presence of the creature, by the knowledge that it was out there, waiting for me. Suddenly, I heard something else. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, steady. They were coming for me. The handle turned, the door creaked, and then there was silence again. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just stood there, waiting,